Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a trope that I know you all love. The grumpy, ancient immortal versus the sleep-deprived, I don't have time for your drama human. This isn't your typical save me from the monster story. In fact, the monster might be the one who needs saving from a failing grade in organic chemistry. Get ready for some serious enemies to consultants to lovers energy. Brace yourselves, because the tension in this library is about to get suffocating. Let's set the scene. The silence in the quiet zone of the main library wasn't your average silence. It was dense, layered with the scent of aging paper, the rhythmic clanking of the ancient heating system, and the metallic smell of rain lashing against the Gothic windows outside. At 11:30 p.m., the world seemed to have shrunk down to this single quadrangle of oak bookshelves and amber lighting. Zadie watched the scene from a prime vantage point, the shadows molding around her as if they were a second skin. She wasn't breathing, not out of necessity, but out of a predator's habit. The air tasted like dust and the cheap coffee wafting from the desk across from her. There she was, Minji. The biochem major was a study in controlled chaos. Her hair was twisted up into a messy bun that seemed to defy the laws of gravity, and her fingers flew across her laptop keyboard with a feverish urgency. To Zadie, who had watched centuries pass like fleeting seasons, this frantic human rush was fascinating and, in a way, deeply irritating. Minji radiated a heat that bridged the physical distance between their tables, a vibrant, pulsating heat, fueled by caffeine and a determination that bordered on sheer stubbornness. Zadie felt a subtle tremor in her own fingers, not from hesitation, but from hunger. It had been 2 days since she last fed, and the warmth emanating from that girl crossed the room like a dare. Zadie was the apex of the food chain, a creature who had seen empires crumble and artists weep before their canvases. Yet here, under the flickering light of a brass desk lamp, with thirst beginning to sharpen her instincts, she felt entirely compelled to break that girl's rhythm. Zadie moved. There was no sound of footsteps, only a displacement of cold air that made the loose papers on Minji's desk flutter for a second. When she stopped beside the girl, the temperature drop was instantaneous. It was as if winter itself had pulled up a chair to study. Zadie leaned in slightly, allowing the ensorcellment, that ancient, intoxicating aura of allure that made mortals willingly surrender their secrets and their throats, to flow over them like a heavy perfume. "You seem tense, darling." Zadie's voice slid out like silk dragging across marble, low, vibrating, perfectly calibrated to echo right in the nerve center of fear and desire. She waited for the wide-eyed stare. She waited for the tremor in the neck, the accelerating pulse that would sound like a welcoming drum in her ears. Zadie was already savoring the anticipation of dominance, the exact moment the prey realizes the predator isn't a metaphor, but an absolute physical presence. However, the drum didn't speed up. Minji didn't even tear her eyes away from her screen, where complex chemical formulas seemed to be fighting their own private war. "I don't have spare change for the campus experimental theater. Unless you're a pizza delivery or the definitive answer to ester synthesis, please evaporate or change frequencies. This whole noir femme fatale tone is interfering with my focus." Zadie froze. The ensorcellment, which was supposed to be foolproof, seemed to bounce right off the girl's barrier of cynicism and exhaustion like a rubber ball hitting concrete. For a split second, the millennial-old vampire's composure slipped. She blinked, genuinely confused, her eyebrows arching in a very human gesture of sheer indignation. She considered amplifying the ensorcellment, focusing it, directing it with the surgical precision she'd mastered in the salons of Versailles, but there was something about this girl's clinical indifference that made her hesitate. Forcing the ensorcellment on a mind like this would be like trying to hypnotize someone who was reading the instructions to the trick out loud. Irritating, and for some reason Zadie preferred not to examine, mildly fascinating. "Excuse me?" Zadie asked, her voice losing a bit of her velvet and gaining a sharp edge of genuine annoyance. "I said it's dangerous. Do you have any idea what I am? What I could do to you between the criminal law stacks?" Minji finally stopped typing. She slowly swiveled around in her rolling chair, which squeaked in protest. Her eyes were bloodshot from fatigue, and the dark circles under them were almost as deep as the scars Zadie carried in her soul. She pushed up her glasses, which were sliding down the bridge of her nose, and leveled a look of clinical impatience at the creature of the night. Dangerous is me failing Organic Chem 2 and losing my scholarship. If you're not a carbon molecule forming a stable covalent bond, get out of my way. You're blocking the only functional light source on this floor. And honestly, this whole ancient tomb meets lavender perfume is a little too heavy for someone who's actively trying to not pass out from sleep deprivation. The insult to her lineage was the final straw. Zadie, the apex predator who had walked through the Black Death without a single hair out of place, felt a twinge of almost childish temper. With a movement too fast for human vision to track, Zadie swiped Minji's stack of notes off the desk. The sharp slap of paper hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent library. The overhead lights flickered, reacting to the sudden discharge of static energy radiating from the vampire. In the blink of an eye, Zadie had Minji pinned against the bookshelf. The intolerant, icy body pressed flush against the student's warm, fragile frame. Zadie let her eyes shift, the deep brown bleeding into an incandescent crimson as her fangs elongated, gleaming under the dim light. "I don't think you understand the protocol here," Zadie hissed, her face mere millimeters from Minji's. The icy, vibrating words saturated the air with brimstone. "I am an immortal nocturnal predator. I have seen empires fall and libraries much grander than this one reduced to ash. I could drain every drop of life from you right now, and no one would hear your screams between the geography and ancient history sections." Zadie's centuries-old script dictated that the human should scream now. She should beg, or at the very least be paralyzed by terror. But Minji did something no victim had ever dared to do. She reached out, grabbed the vampire's face, and pulled her closer to examine her eyes with an alarming level of scientific curiosity. "Interesting," Minji murmured, completely ignoring the lethal fangs hovering near her jugular. "The gingival retraction to expose the canines is instantaneous, but I'm not observing any soft tissue inflammation, and the vascularization in your sclera, those definitely aren't contacts. The pupillary dilation is autonomic and reacting to my proximity, not the light. You are a fascinating biological specimen." "What? What are you doing? Let me go," Zadie sputtered, feeling her cheeks being squished by Minji's warm, slightly ink-stained femurs. The vampire's dignity was rapidly circling the drain. "You're a vampire. Great, that simplifies everything," Minji said, releasing her face and adjusting her glasses again as if she had just verified a footnote in a textbook. "Simplifies? I just threatened your life. I am the literal embodiment of your demise. And I have a deadline in exactly 4 hours, dangerously low glucose levels, and type O negative blood, which I know your favorite if the myths have any basis in actual hematology. Can you actually turn me into a vampire too, or are you just looking for a snack?" "Turn you?" you repeated, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "You just met the personification of death, and your first question is if she offers a loyalty rewards program?" "Pragmatism," Minji replied, shrugging. "Immortality would permanently solve the deadline issue, but whatever, scratch that." She pointed at her laptop. "Look, you've had every chance to bite me, but you'd rather stand here making small talk. Let's make a deal, Predator. Do you want a snack, or do you want to keep striking dramatic poses in the dark for an audience that is way too busy to care? Let's put this chemistry on hold because I have a paper on the Black Death to proofread, and frankly, my bibliography is absolute garbage." Zadie looked at Minji's exposed neck, where her pulse throbbed with an insulting amount of vitality, and then at the computer screen, cluttered with technical jargon and inaccurate dates. For the first time in 700 years, the impenetrable wall Zadie had built around herself wavered under the weight of human pragmatism. She could turn Minji into a vampire, she could drain her dry, or she could just have a small snack and let Minji wake up the next morning with a hangover and her memory wiped, exactly like she always did to cover her tracks. But she didn't want to. This human had something that Zadie wanted more. She listened to the proposal and decided to see exactly where this was going. The Black Death? Zadie asked, thoroughly offended. I read what you wrote in that paragraph over there. Your date on the Florence outbreak is off by 2 whole months, and the hygiene of the era wasn't nearly as deplorable as you modern historians love to paint it. I myself maintained an excellent skincare routine for the 14th century. Minji smiled, a tired smile, but one that held a distinct spark of triumph. Excellent. You're a primary source. The proposal is simple. I let you drink a little. Don't get greedy. I need to be conscious for my 8 a.m. class. If you proofread the bibliography and fact-check the history on this paper right now. Zadie sighed, a long, icy exhale that turned the tip of Minji's nose pink. She sank into the empty chair beside her, ostensibly defeated by the unshakable logic of a college student in crisis, but in reality entirely consumed by an unprecedented curiosity. Wait, before we see if Zadie actually knows how to use a red pen, if you're enjoying this academic anxiety meets ancient evil vibe, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next time a monster gets put to work. It helps the channel more than a type O negative donor helps Zadie. Okay, back to the library. Fine, but if I find a single glaring grammatical error or a poorly translated Latin citation, I am draining you dry out of pure academic principle. My time is valuable, mortal. If you've ever found yourself walking that tightrope between desire and duty, between the danger that makes your heart race and the deadline that crushes it, you know that what happened next was the beginning of something neither of them could control. In that liminal space between the dead of night and the break of dawn, the line between predator and prey started to blur, making way for an intimacy forged in exhaustion and necessity. What started as a transactional deal was about to become an emotional debt no academic thesis could ever pay off. The following hours were filled with the sound of Zadie dictating corrections with an aristocratic precision, while Minji typed frantically. The physical proximity was unavoidable. Zadie needed to read the screen over Minji's shoulder, and the heat of the girl's skin acted like a magnet to the vampire's perpetual chill. Duke Lazarus of Tenebra would never say that, Zadie murmured, her hand resting dangerously close to Minji's on the desk. He was a man of excess, yes, but he had a mortal terror of appearing vulgar to the court. Use strategic opulence instead of ostentation. Minji obeyed, her fingers faltering for a split second when the tip of Zadie's cold finger brushed against her wrist. It was barely a touch, just millimeters of contact, but the electricity that shot across Minji's skin had absolutely nothing to do with the library's faulty wiring. She caught Zadie's scent again. It wasn't just lavender and old tombs. It was the smell of snow falling on pine trees. Something vast, ancient, and terribly lonely. With every sensory zoom, the tension thickened. Zadie watched Minji's pupils dilate under the dim glow of the desk lamp, not because of the ensorcellment, but because of something much more real. She tracked the almost imperceptible tremble of the bottom lip when she was hyperfixated, and the way the blue light from the monitor carved out the angles of her face. Zadie's hunger was shifting. It was no longer a metabolic thirst for blood, but a deep yearning to be seen, to be acknowledged not as a monster, but as someone who had witnessed both the beauty and the agony of the world. "Why do you do it?" Minji asked, suddenly, her hands stopping on the keys. The silence grew heavy again, but this time it was loaded, pregnant with subtext. Study art history for the 3rd time? You already know everything that happened. You lived through it. Zadie looked away. Her gaze drifted to the Gothic windows. The rain had softened into a persistent drizzle. Because the world forgets, Minji, and when it forgets, it becomes ugly. I stay here to make sure that, at least in my head, the colors of the original paintings never fade. And because I've been to dozens of universities all over the world, and these are the only places where people are constantly coming and going. No one stays long enough to ask me why I don't age. They just assume I'm a dedicated academic or some eccentric goth. I change my name, I change my major, until I need to change universities entirely. Minji was fading. The caffeine was wearing off, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. Zadie offered to type for her. Minji sat back and watched, noticing the way Zadie's jaw clenched whenever she spotted a historical inaccuracy. "You're staring at me," Zadie said, not looking up from the screen. "You're very thorough," Minji whispered. Her voice was pure gravel. Zadie finally looked at her. The Ice Queen facade wasn't just cracking, it was melting completely. "In 700 years, no one has ever asked me to be useful. I'm usually a monster to be feared or a secret to be kept. You treated me like a consultant." Minji felt a lump form in her throat. The stress of the week, the fear of failing, and the intense magnetic presence of this woman were suddenly boiling over. "You treated me like a person," Minji said, her voice shaking slightly. "Because I'm too tired to be afraid, Zadie, and because I think you're lonely, even for someone who lived through the Renaissance." Zadie flinched as if she'd been struck. Her eyes softened, betraying a profound, ancient ache. "I was wrong," Zadie admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I tried to scare you because it's the only way I know how to connect. I apologize for knocking over your notes." Minji leaned forward. The space between them crackled with electricity. The smell of bitter coffee and crisp mountain air tangled together. Minji reached out, her hand hovering just over Zadie's. She could feel the cold radiating off Zadie's skin, like an open window in the dead of winter. "My heart is beating really fast, Zadie. Can you hear it?" Zadie's throat swallowed hard. "Yes, it's deafening." The climax of their physical proximity brought an abrupt retreat. Zadie stood up suddenly, shoving her chair back with disproportionate force. She walked over to the window, turning her back to Minji. The fear, the very real fear of caring, of creating a bond she would only have to watch wither and die in a few human decades, hit her harder than any wooden stake ever could. "The paper is done," Zadie said, her voice turning cold again, desperate to re-establish the distance. "You should submit it now, the deadline is approaching." Minji felt the walls coming back up, but she wasn't your average prey. She stood up and walked right over to the vampire, stopping directly behind her. "Your heart doesn't beat, Zadie, but I can feel you vibrating. Are you scared I'll find you normal, or are you scared I'll find you extraordinary?" Zadie spun around, a sarcastic deflection locked and loaded on her tongue, but the words died in her throat. Minji placed her warm hand squarely on Zadie's freezing one, which was gripping the stone windowsill. The contrast was a total system shock, fire and ice meeting in a silent pact. "I am a biochem major, remember?" Minji whispered, tilting her face up closer to Zadie's. "I know how to differentiate an adrenaline response triggered by fear from one triggered by attraction. My cortisol levels are dropping now that the paper is done. What's flooding my bloodstream right now is dopamine and oxytocin, and I don't really think it's from the espresso." Zadie felt her own resistance collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. She looked at Minji's lips, at the hesitation of a finger before it traced the line of her neck, feeling the searing heat of her skin millimeters before the actual touch. The tension that had been spooling up all night, the hunger, the danger, the total loss of control converged onto that single point of contact. "You should run. I'm a predator." "You're a nerd, Zadie. An immortal, terrifying nerd, but a nerd." "No one has ever accused me of that before." "Well," Minji said, a soft, exhausted smirk playing on her lips, "on top of being a nerd, you're incredibly smart and gorgeous in a way I literally cannot ignore." Zadie gave a small, genuine smile, closed her eyes, and let Minji close the final gap between them. They stood face to face, foreheads resting together, heat against cold, breaths mingling in the quiet air. Minji reached up and cupped Zadie's face with incredible tenderness. The vampire melted into the touch, leaning her cheek heavily into the palm of the girl's hand. "You know, in 700 years, no one has ever touched me like this. I'm usually either a monster or a goddess. This is new territory." Zadie caught her by the waist and pulled her flush against her, so firmly it made Minji gasp and rise up on her toes. "Your heart is beating even faster now, Minji. Scared?" now that you've realized you're locked in with a predator who hasn't fed in 2 days? I know it's not my blood you're starving for. The kiss started soft, a shock to the system, ice against fire, slow and exploratory, two opposite worlds colliding. But within seconds, Minji gripped the back of Zadie's neck with a firmness that completely caught the immortal off guard, dragging her down into her warmth, while Zadie lost herself in the intoxicating sensation of being, for the first time in centuries, truly touched. It wasn't the kiss of a victim and a monster. It was a collision of wills, an absolute overflow of yearning that words could no longer hold back. Okay, I might actually like this more than your type O blood, Zadie murmured against her lips, right before lifting Minji up into her arms with a fluid ease that left the human breathless. Outside, the early dawn remained silent and empty. Inside the library, time seemed to stop entirely. In the peak of that surrender, as light and shadow fused together, the outside world ceased to exist. It was as if water was spilling over the edges of a cup that was far too small, the rain on the glass fading into the background until the library transformed into something intimately, entirely theirs. Suddenly, a bold ray of morning sun sliced through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains, striking the oak desk. Minji saw it first. "Zadie, the sun! I mean, are you going to turn to dust? Explode? Whatever, it doesn't matter. Just go. I do not want to watch you evaporate right here." Zadie let out a real, uninhibited laugh, a sound that hadn't left her throat in so long it felt foreign, but incredibly sweet. Then she smiled, not the calculated smirk of a predator, but something smaller, warmer, and much more real, and slipped backward into the shadows of the stacks without making a single sound, as if the darkness had simply swallowed her whole. "Bye, nerd," the vampire whispered, a wicked gleam in her eyes as the crimson bled back into a warm brown. "See you in the footnotes." Minji woke up sometime later, her face resting on her folded arms across the library desk. The early dawn sun was now pouring fully through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her neck was perfectly intact. Her paper had been successfully submitted at 4:50 a.m., but the chair next to her was empty and cold. A sudden wave of melancholy washed over her, the crushing weight of reality threatening to break the spell of the night before. She honestly wondered if the whole thing had just been a hyper-realistic hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and way too much caffeine. But then she looked to her right. Sitting there was an iced coffee from that ridiculously expensive cafe 3 blocks away that Minji could never afford, and a note written in elegant, looping, excessively ornate, antique calligraphy. "Meet me in the dining hall at noon. They serve that chocolate pudding I actually tolerate, and since I didn't bite you, I feel like you still owe me a thorough explanation of the Krebs cycle. P.S. The sun thing, total myth. I love the beach. I left early because Cafe Brera opens at 5:30 a.m. The first cup of the day rightfully belongs to whoever gets there before the open sign is flipped, and my 700 years have taught me that some battles are absolutely worth fighting. I wanted you to try the best coffee in the city. With love and hunger, Z." Minji smiled, feeling the condensation of the cold coffee cup against her fingers and something incredibly warm blossoming in her chest. She shut her laptop, more than ready to face her 8 a.m. class. "Noon," she whispered to herself. "I can stay awake until then." After all, the hunt was just beginning, and she had the distinct feeling that the predator wasn't the only one eagerly anticipating the next chapter. So, the moral of the story, always fact-check your sources, especially if they have fangs, and never underestimate a biochem major with a deadline. They contain even the oldest monsters with a well-placed bibliography. If you want more of this supernatural study buddy energy, let me know in the comments. See you in the next drama.